Alright everyone, so we are going to do another video giving commentary on the thoughts and words of the Honorable Muammar Gaddafi, who was murdered by NATO in 2011. I am taking his words from his own book, Escape to Hell and Other Stories by Muammar Gaddafi, edited by Pierre Salinger, who writes a very interesting introduction to this book. Gaddafi, as I said in my last video, he had a very good sense of humor, but at the same time, he was very observing and astute, and he had a deep understanding of politics and how Western politics work in the context of geopolitics. Basically, how the Western world screws over the underdeveloped countries or the members of the so-called Third World. Gaddafi talks about how the most vicious tyranny doesn't really come from individual countries, nor does it come from individual people. Muammar Gaddafi talks about how the most vicious tyranny comes from the masses, the mob, or the collective. Basically, a quagmire of people filled with bloodlust and intentions of murder and killing in the name of revolution and democracy is the worst tyrant. And I'm going to read to you guys an excerpt from this. This is from Escape to Hell. And he says, "How cruel people can be when they rise up together, a crushing flood that has no mercy for anything in its path." And he actually uses this term, the tyranny of the masses. And he says here that the group can get rid of him when it wishes, talking about the individual. The individual may be removed by another individual who himself may be worthless and unimportant. But the tyranny of the masses is the hardest type of tyranny. For who can stand against a crushing current, against a blind, overwhelming force? And out of all the people in the world, Gaddafi would definitely be amongst those most qualified to talk about this, because he was actually murdered by a mob in a very brutal way, thanks to the Obama administration and Hillary Clinton. And remember how Hillary Clinton mocked him? "We saw him, we found him, and he died, ha ha ha!" And Gaddafi was actually killed in a very undignified manner. He was actually sodomized and murdered. It was pretty horrific. I really felt bad for the guy, actually. And Gaddafi has been portrayed as this, evil dictator, hated America, he hated Israel, but he was actually very moderate. I never got the impression that Gaddafi was this evil dictator. He killed all those people in Pan Am over Lockerbie. Initially, they said that was Syria and Iran. Then they changed the narrative and said, oh no, it's actually Gaddafi who did it. Gaddafi just woke up out of his tent one day, drinking his black tea, and said, I think I'm going to take down a plane. You know what? I'm kind of bored right now. I gotta take down a plane. People believe these narratives. They really don't make a whole lot of sense. It's interesting that Gaddafi, minorities were actually protected under him. Minorities were protected under Gaddafi. There was a black minority in Libya, and they were protected. And after the death of Gaddafi, you heard all these stories, these horror stories of blacks being sadistically abused by people. There are videos that you can find online of blacks in Libya literally in cages, like dogs in a pound. Horrifically abused, women raped. There was a story, and I remember, just talking about this brings back morbid memories of the news I used to read a lot about. There was a story I remember, it came out, I want to say in 2015, some blacks, I think they weren't from Senegal, maybe Senegal, I'm not sure, but they were from one of those, I think West African countries. They were trying to get on a boat to escape to Europe from the horrors that they were seeing in Africa. They got on a boat. The boat was being guided by 2 Libyan captains. And the captains decided that they were going to use these blacks as entertainment. And so they had the black Christians thrown off the ship, and they laughed as they watched these people drown. And this was actually reported in the Italian news. Thankfully, the Italian government had these people arrested and brought to justice for murder. Horrifically enough, there was some people in the right wing saying we do not sympathize with these Africans at all because they were migrants on the way to invade Europe. That's right. Invading Europe, trying to escape the hells of Africa to find a better life in Europe. They're taking over Europe, man. That wasn't a ship full of sad migrants. Those were soldiers, everyone. And amazingly, I actually know the lady who wrote that article saying that these black Christians were invaders. She was actually writing for our website, shootbot.com. When I found the article, I was so upset. Eventually, we had to get rid of this woman because she was so inflammatory. Bonnie Ental is her name, in case you're wondering. But that is the poison of the right wing, and we're seeing this increasingly. But going back to what I was saying about Gaddafi's wisdom, and this really falls right in line with what I've just talked about, you know, the hatred for the migrants, the saying that we have no sympathy for these people who drowned, using the migrants drowning to death as entertainment. What does this all signify? It signifies the truth of what Gaddafi has said in this book, and that is that the tyranny of the mob is the worst. The tyranny of the mob is the worst. We may complain about our governments, right? Our Western governments. We may complain about NATO or the EU, but the reality is that these institutions, they're not as bad as what would come about if mobs got their way. Now, granted, NATO has done some pretty evil things, but if you removed NATO, you would remove America's preponderating position in the world, and Japan, Germany, Turkey would become the big guys, and that would be tremendously much worse. That doesn't mean that we don't criticize NATO when it needs to be done. I think that NATO simply needs to be reformed, but what do I know? That's never going to happen. There is this very interesting phenomenon, and this is what I wanted to touch upon in this video. There is a very interesting phenomenon that has been going on the internet for a long time. It's been going on since the Obama administration. And that is this sort of woke journalism regarding the corruption of Western governments. Now, don't get me wrong, a lot of this type of journalism preaches truth. It points out real evil corruptions and abuses done by Western governments and corporations. And I'm not discrediting that information. I'm not here to argue against that information. What I am here to argue about, or argue against, or what I am here to observe is the intention of such journalism. Now, granted, a lot of these journalists mean well, and they don't want any evil or anything like that. They just want to report the news and expose evil. Fine, God bless you. But you do have, for example, this very dark element in this type of journalism that is really anti-authority. Now, they say that they are anti-tyranny, anti-authoritarianism, or anti-totalitarianism, anti-neoconservative, anti-neoliberal. But the reality is that they are just anti-authority altogether, and that is the danger. That is the danger, because what they're asking for is anarchy. And that's what these types of people ultimately want. I think there's one lady who pushes anarchy. Her name is Carrie Weidler, I think. And then you have Justin King, mostly known as Beau of the Fifth Column, whose videos I do watch and whose videos are quite erudite and knowledgeable, but the agenda, the ultimate agenda, is nefarious, and that is the agenda of anarchism. There was a video I remember seeing a while back, or not a while back, but just really a few days ago. There's this guy, I think his name is James Freeman. I can look it up real quick. I forgot this guy's name, but his last name is Freeman. But he's like one of these anti-police guys, if you know what I'm saying. He talks about like the evils of the police, and I'm gonna find out their names real quick. But this guy will talk about like, oh, police brutality and how bad police brutality is. And yes, there is such a thing as police brutality. I'm not going to sit here and deny it. And I'm not going to sit here and talk as if cops are saints. Nonetheless, cops are necessary for society. And if anyone tells you otherwise, those people are full of crap. Cops are definitely necessary. So yes, here, I found the names here. Okay, hold on. James Freeman and Mark Burgess. James Freeman and Mark Burgess. These guys are monsters. And they talk about, F the police and police brutality, but, they'll talk about the corruptions of the police. But they use that as really a cover-up for their true agenda, and that is just hating the police and wanting anarchy. James Freeman literally walks up to random cops and questions them. Like, you know how when cops stop you, they say, do you have any alcohol in your body? Have you been doing any drinking? Do you have any weapons? Do you have any drugs? Yada, yada, yada. And he walks up to cops and questions them. It's like, well, they question us, so why can't we question them? It's like, well, because they have the authority to do that. So it's just anti-authority. And there's a video of Burgess giving the middle finger to some cops, saying, F you, F this, da, da, da. And then he says, you're not going to do crap. You're just going to take it, yada, yada, yada. And then when the cops don't take it, they actually tackle down Burgess and arrest him. And he's screaming and this and that. And then Freeman says, you're arresting him? You're arresting him for speaking his mind? And the way he frames it is very deceptive. It's like, well, yeah, he was speaking his mind, but what was in his mind was complete poison. But the way that they frame it is it's very weaselly. It's like, oh, you're arresting him for speaking his mind. It's like if I got up in the middle of an airplane and said there's a bomb on the plane, and then the pilot did an emergency landing, and then I said, oh, it was just a joke, and then they arrested me, and I'll say, oh, you're arresting me for telling the joke. It's that type of mentality. It's very toxic. But these types of people, who bash the cops, F the police this, F the police that, they're just anti-authority at the end of the day. Yes, there are corruptions in police. Yes, there are corrupt cops. Yes, there are cops who do evil things. Yes, there are cops who shoot people without any sort of they shoot people without justification. Yes, all these things do happen. But that doesn't mean we get rid of the police. That doesn't mean we say police is automatically evil and we should have automatically anarchy. Because if you think that the EU is bad, if you think that America is bad, or that government in general is bad, then you haven't been under a mob. The tyranny of the masses is much more vicious than any tyranny in the world, really. The mob violence is horrific. Now you can say, what about the Soviet Union? What about communism? Well, the Soviet Union was brought about through mob rule. There was a revolution. There was a peasant uprising. If you look at what happened in Cambodia with the Khmer Rouge, that also involved a pretty vicious mob, because these sort of regimes ultimately are brought about through getting the peasantry or the working class very angry against the rich. And that's another thing. It's another thing that I've seen a lot of on the internet, this whole like Joker mentality of, the evil rich. Yeah, there are some pretty evil rich people out there, Paul Singer. And yes, the wealthy do a lot of evil and a lot of destruction in the world. But that doesn't mean that poor people are automatic saints. And that doesn't mean that if you were to give the power to the poor, that they would just be just and nice and just amazing forces of civility. People, for the most part, are pretty evil when you give them tremendous amounts of power. So the poor who are complaining about the rich, well, what if we gave those poor people tremendous amounts of power? They would abuse it. That doesn't mean that we abuse the poor. There's a saying that some Eastern Christian saint said this. I don't remember who, but it was something like, the poor live for the sake, or sorry, the rich live for the sake of the poor, and the poor live for the salvation of the rich. Yes, they are rich people. They have lots of money. They're very powerful, but they also have responsibility. And that responsibility is to take care of the people who are less fortunate. Poor people also have a responsibility as well, and that is, well, to do work, and to better the community and better society. When I say work, I don't mean be slaves, but the poor also have a responsibility as well. Everyone has their responsibilities, and that responsibility is determined by our own capacity and our own limitations. What is needed is not the destruction of the poor or the dismantling of government or the getting rid of police. What is needed is balance. That is the ultimate message, I think, in this video. What is needed is balance at the end of the day. We need rich people. We need poor people. We need working people. We need immigrants. We need migrant labor. We need all of these things. Everything within an equilibrium and everyone doing their part. What we don't need is a giant aggregate of bloodlust and sanguinary desires filled with rage against the establishment and the institutions. Because what good does destruction bring? It's like that story I remember reading. I think this was from the 14th century. There was a revolution in France. I know, surprise, right? And the peasants revolted against the landlords or the landowners. And they took a nobleman, murdered him, and then cooked him. They rotisseried him. They put him over those fires and twisted him around like they would a chicken. And they forced his wife and children to watch. It was pretty horrific. And then you have the French Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, the whole thing with the Khmer Rouge. You look at all these revolutions, and what do they bring at the end of the day? They bring tyranny. I mean, Napoleon, not dynamite, Napoleon Bonaparte was a totalitarian. He was a dictator. He was evil. But he was brought to power thanks to the mob. So if you want to talk about the rise of the people and why we need revolution, don't forget that if you do a successful revolution, that it's going to be funded by who? The rich that you claim to be against. And once the revolution succeeds, it's going to be to the benefit of those investors. And you eventually are going to get canceled out. And you will realize that you have done nothing more than bring to power a government that is worse than the government that you overthrew. If you do a revolution, then you're just helping the people that you claim to be against. Anyway, just some of my thoughts. Hope you guys have enjoyed this message. Hope you guys have learned something from this message. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.